Yep. Kick back. Yep, that's a freestyle, man.
Welcome to Elevated Healthy, where we bring you content for your conscience that makes much sense.
Right to the new age.
We're gonna get started in a little minute.
So brave. That's why they like it to the rave. In the media, about how we rap up, turn it up, and give you what you need. Every day, man, that's consistency. Yeah, ass easily. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the recipe. And I do it well. Look at me now, dog. And everything came to fruition. Because I was every day add to the percentages until it came whole. Now I'm sitting fast down, sucking man like it's supposed to. My dad's take a trip to Memphis. Off they get weird. Shout out DJ Mac, Memphis. You know what's up. Yeah, now I'm in that motherfucker. Little Rock, yo, man. Now I'm motherfucker swing 30, man, to the Dallas State. Oak Cliff, man, shit, dog. Yeah, it's like Dallas. Yeah, get it in, man, shit. Hustling on, energized. No batteries in the back, dog. Shit, I use my mind, but that's why I motherfucker pretty fine. Yeah, man, dust that dust, it's dirty all down. Now motherfucker is shining, man. That's why I'm running. Feels good, man. That metronome, that's why I'm being on time for this. Yeah, man, shit. So legitimate. On my pilgrimage, where it is your village. I might just pull up, what? Good, yo. Yeah, money, power, respect, man. That's the motto. Yeah, glorious. How we rap so ferocious. So, yeah, man, cause commotion, motion, control. And it's all good, man. Yeah, right. United, BAB. You're striking, man. Shit, yeah, fast. Like lightning.
Yeah. Welcome to the Elevated Healthy channel, where we're bringing you content for your conscience that makes much sense. And I'm your host, Elevated Healthy. And this is part 5 of Massacres in U.S. history. The dark truth never taught will shock your core. Yes. And we're going to get right into it, starting off with July 29th, 1910, Slocum Massacre in Texas. Time period 1910. So now we're moving into that 21st century or 20th century. We passed 17, 15, 16, 1700s, 1800s, and now we're in the 1900 periods, and we're still seeing this behavior carry on. By E.R. Bills. The 1910 Slocum Massacre in East Texas officially saw between 8 and 22 African Americans killed, and evidence suggests casualties were 10 times these amounts. Yet the massacre has become a dirty Lone Star secret, remarkable more for the inattention it has received than for its remembrance. Slocum Massacre genocide in East Texas. Unlike most Texas communities in the earlier 20th century, the unincorporated town of Slocum, like Rosewood, Florida, was largely African American, with several black citizens considerably propertied and a few owning stores and other businesses. This alone, in parts of the South, might have been enough to foment violence. But in the area around Slocum, roughly 100 miles east of Waco, there were other issues, according to newspaper reports, and other sometimes conflicting accounts of the massacre. When a white man reportedly tried to collect a disputed debt from a well regarded black citizen, a confrontation occurred. Hard feelings lingered when a regional road construction foreman put an African American in charge of rounding up help for local road improvements. A prominent white citizen named Jim Spurger was infuriated and became an agitator. Rumors spread, warning of threats against Anglo citizens and plans for race riots. White malcontents manipulated the local Anglo population, and on July 29th, white hysteria transmorphified into bloodshed. Scores of Negroes were shot dead. Race rioted near Slocum, Texas, results in terrible slaughter of blacks. Desperate fighting has occurred between bands of armed whites and Negroes in a race riot at Slocum, Texas, as the result of a cold blooded murder of a white man by a Negro. 20 Negroes and 3 white men were killed. The Slocum violence was reported in various degrees of truth and newspapers across the country at the time. Stoked and goaded by Spurgeon and others, a collection of white mobs made up Slocum locals and heavily armed white residents from all over Anderson County roamed through the area in groups of 6 or 7 or in mobs of 30 to 40, and, according to some reports, up to 200 members. Members of the mobs engaged in what authorities later termed a potshot occasion, firing on black citizens at will. They moved from road to road and cabin to cabin, shooting down African Americans in their tracks. Survivors of the bloodshed spread the word, and African Americans began fleeing. The white mobs followed blacks into the surrounding forests and marshes and shot many victims in the back as they fled. Several bodies were discovered with bundles of clothing and personal effects at their sides. Every initial newspaper report on the transpiring bloodshed portrayed the African Americans as armed instigators, but these accounts were heinous mischaracterizations. Anderson County Sheriff William H. Black of Palestine, Texas, and Special Deputy Godfrey Reeves Fowler arrived in the Slocum area, and they discovered a terrified white populace, most of whom had slept overnight in churches and schoolhouses. But it was increasingly apparent that the alleged African American mob that had supposedly conspired to attack the local white community hadn't materialized. When reporters gathered on July 31, up to 2 dozen murders had been reported, but local authorities had only 8 bodies. Sheriff Black said it would be difficult to find out just how many were killed because they were scattered all over the woods, and buzzards would find many of the victims first. Men were going about killing Negroes as fast as they could find them, Sheriff Black told the New York Times. These Negroes have done no wrong that I can discover. Black continued, I don't know how many were in the mob, but there may have been 200 or 300. They hunted the Negroes down like sheep. The truth is, a harrowing number of African Americans were slaughtered in the counties of Anderson and Houston in the midsummer of 1910, yet today it's almost never spoke of, much less widely acknowledged, sufficiently researched, or historically considered, including its omission in a centennial history of Anderson County, Texas, 1936, and a history of Houston County, Texas, 1687 to 1979 and 1979. Context and national response. In every month for the 6 months leading up to the Slocum Massacre, an African American in the East Texas region was executed by a white mob based on allegations alone. No trials, no jury, simply white verdicts. After the lynching of Allen Brooks just 4 months prior to the Slocum Massacre, a photograph of his hanging body in a crowd of 100 spectators was made into a postcard that was mailed to friends and family, and these injustices were exceptions to the rule. Rather, they were the rule under which African Americans lived and died in that part of the world. So Allen Brooks was lynched on Ackerd and I believe Main Street in Dallas, downtown Dallas, Texas, on an Elks Arch, right? And they put it on a postcard and mailed it to all their friends and family. And there was a placard. People like myself and others been advocating for these markers to be recognized. Somebody took it and destroyed it, but they end up putting another one up. You can't even have a placard, showing what's been going on in this nation now. Somebody hating. Let's continue. J. Milton Waldron, J. Anderson Taylor, and W. J. Howard signed the letter on behalf of 150 ministers asking President Taft for help. On August 13, 1910, a group of more than 150 African American ministers from Washington, D.C., sent a letter to President Taft regarding the Slocum Massacre. In the letter, the committee implored President Taft to use the powers of his great office to suppress lynchings, murder, and other forms of lawlessness, and to do something to make human life more valuable and law more universally respected. The Eternal General responded on August 24 with a succinct letter stating, "The protection of life and property is generally a duty developing up the state the protection of life and property is generally a duty devolving up the state authorities," and continued, "Your letter and petition deal with the subject of the treatment of colored persons generally, and therefore furnish no facts which would warrant this department in taking any steps to redress the wrongs complained of." Trial and aftermath. At the initial grand jury hearing of the suspects charged in the Slocum atrocity, nearly every remaining resident was subpoenaed. Some refused to testify and were arrested. By the time the grand jury findings were reported on August 17, several hundred witnesses had been examined. Though 11 men were initially arrested, 7 were indicted. The grand jury judge moved the trial to Harris County. Distrusting the potential jury of peers the defendants might receive in Anderson County, the indictments received no interest or justice in Harris County. Eventually, all those charged were released and none of the indictments were ever prosecuted. In the meanwhile, the personal holdings of many Slocum area Anglo citizens fortuitously increased. The abandoned African American properties were absorbed or repurposed as the now majority white population saw fit. The standard Southern Anglo-centric world order was restored. The community reflects effects of the event to this day, while most nearby towns have African American populations of 20% or more. Slocum is just under 7%. Recent acknowledgments. On March 30, 2011, after a two-part February feature on the Slocum Massacre by Tim Madigan in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the 82nd Texas Legislature adopted House of Representatives Resolution 865 acknowledging the incident. On January 16, 2016, a historical marker to the Slocum Massacre was unveiled in a Washington Post article. Constance Holly Jawad, who is a descendant of victims of the massacre and who applied for the historical marker, said, "This most definitely helps restore the Slocum massacre to its proper place." Holly Jawad continued, "It was being ignored, and by ignoring it, you're spitting in the face of those who died during the tragic event. You're basically saying either it didn't happen or it's not important, and it's very, very important." Okay, let's read up on this. Racial Slocum Massacre. Racial tensions in American early 20th century were sometimes punctuated by violent outbursts. One such occasion began near Slocum and Denson Springs and spread across a wide area near the Anderson-Houston county line. Beginning on the morning of July 29, 1910, groups of armed white men shot and killed African Americans, first firing on a group near Sadler's Creek. Murders in the black community continued during the remainder of that day and night. Accounts in state and national newspapers brought widespread attention to the situation. Georgia's ordered saloons and gun and ammunition stores to close, and state militia and Texas Rangers were dispatched to the area. The murders of 8 men were officially recorded. The victims were Cleveland Larkin, Alex Holly, Sam Baker, Dick Wilson, Jeff Wilson, Ben Dancer, John Hayes, and Will Burley. Many African American families fled the area and did not return. 11 white men were soon arrested, and District Judge Benjamin H. Gardner impaneled a grand jury within a week. When its findings were reported on August 17, 7 men were indicted. These cases were moved to Harris County but were never prosecuted. The events, which came to be known as the Slocum Massacre, largely disappeared from public view. In subsequent generations, in 2011, the 82nd Texas Legislature adopted a resolution acknowledging the incident. and stating that only by shining a light on previous injustice can we learn from them and move toward a future of greater healing and reconstruction. Market as property of state of Texas, 2015. All right. Despite local opposition to the market, Chris Florence, spokesperson for the Texas Historical Society, told the Washington Post, "There's difficult history in the state, and this shows there has been a lot of change." Longtime state judge Bascom Bentley also noted, "I'm glad the market is there. It's part of our history and ugly part. But the purpose of history is to teach us how to do better in the present and future. The atrocities committed in the Slocum area in 1910 should give us all pause and spur commitments to definitively establish the truth, fully acknowledge it, and honestly and constructively address it." E.R. Bills is the author of the 1910 Slocum Massacre, an act of genocide in East Texas. Bills received a degree in journalism from Southwest Texas State University in 1990. Reprinted here with permission of the author, version of the story has been published on the Citizen Voice, the Statesman, and the Patrick Murphy blog. Our thanks to Constance Holly Jawad, formerly Constance Holly Ramirez, a descendant of victims of the 1910 Slocum Massacre, for sharing the story with the Gen Education Project. Holly Jawad was a Dallas Independent School District principal for many years. All right, so that's the Slocum Massacre. Um, if y'all like this content, thank y'all for watching and listening. You know what I'm saying? Share it with your subscribers because we're gonna keep this going, man. For sure, for sure. Okay. All right. So let's get back to the features at hand. April 20, 1914, Ludlow Massacre. Howard Zinn first learned of the Ludlow Massacre from a song by Woody Guthrie, which Zinn says nobody has ever mentioned in any of my history courses. To help future generations of students learn about Ludlow, here are Zinn's description of the history from A People's History of the United States and a video interview with Zinn about the significance of Ludlow. Striking family at Ludlow shortly before the April 20, 1914 massacre. Shortly after Woodrow Wilson took office, there began in Colorado one of the most bitter and violent struggles between workers and corporate capital in the history of the country. This was the Colorado coal strike that began in September 19 and culminated in the Ludlow massacre of April 1914. Even 11,000 miners in southern Colorado worked for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, which was owned by the Rockefeller family. Aroused by the murder of one of their organizers, they went on strike against low pay, dangerous conditions, and feudal domination of their lives in towns completely controlled by the mining companies. When the strike began, the miners were immediately evicted from their shacks in the mining towns. Aided by the United Mine Workers Union, they set up tents in the nearby hills and carried on the strike, the picketing from these tent colonies. The gunmen hired by the Rockefeller interest, the Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency, used Gatling guns and rifles, raided the tent colonies. The death list of miners grew, but they hung on, drove back, an armored train and a gun battle, fought to keep out strikebreakers. With the miners resisting, refusing to give in, the mines not able to operate, the Colorado governor, referred to by a Rockefeller mine manager as our little cowboy governor, called out the National Guard, with the Rockefeller supplying the Guard's wages. The Ludlow Tent Colony for the massacre, one of the 1,200 striking miner families in the Ludlow tent colony. The miners at first thought the guard was sent to protect them and greeted its arrival with flags and cheer. They soon found out the guard was there to destroy the strike. The guard brought strike breakers in undercover of night, not telling them there was a strike. Guardsmen beat miners, arrested them by the hundreds, rode down with their horses parades of women in the streets of Trinidad, the central town in the area, and still the miners refused to give in. When they lasted through the cold winter of 1913 and 1914, it became clear that extraordinary measures would be needed to break the strike. In April 1914, two National Guard companies were stationed in the hills overlooking the largest tent colony of strikers, the one at Ludlow, housing 1,000 men, women, children. On the morning of 1820, a machine gun attack began on the tents. The miners fired back. Their leader was lured up into the hills to discuss the truth, then shot to death by a company of National Guardsmen. The women and children dug pits beneath the tents to escape the gunfire. At dusk, the guard moved down the hills from the hills with torches, set fire to the tents, and the families fled into the hills. 13 people were killed by gunfire. The following day, a telephone linesman going through the ruins of the Ludlow Tent Company lifted an iron cot covering a pit of one of the tents and found the charred, twisted bodies of 11 children and two women. This became known as the Ludlow Massacre. The Ludlow Tent Colony ruins. Almost look like a body right there. The news spread quickly over the country. In Denver, the United Mine Workers issued a call to arms, gather together for defensive purposes, all arms and ammunition legally available. 300 armed strikers marched from other tent colonies into the Ludlow area, cut telephone and telegraph wires, and prepared for battle. Railroad workers refused to take soldiers from Trinidad to Ludlow. At Colorado Springs, 300 Union miners walked off their jobs and headed for the Trinidad district, carrying revolvers, rifles, and shotguns. Armed strikers. In Trinidad itself, miners attended a funeral service for the 26 dead at Ludlow, then walked from the funeral to a nearby building where arms were stacked for them. They picked up rifles and moved into the hills, destroying mines, killing mine guards, exploding mine shafts. The press reported the hills in every direction seemed suddenly to be alive with men. In Denver, 82 soldiers in a company on a troop train headed for Trinidad refused to go. The press reported the men declared they would not engage in the shooting of women and children. They hissed at they hissed the 350 men who did start and shouted imprecations at them. 5,000 people demonstrated in the rain on the lawn in the front of the state capitol at Denver, asking the National Guard officers at Ludlow be tried for murder, denouncing the governor as an accessory. The Denver Cigar Makers Union voted to send 500 armed men to Ludlow and Trinidad. Women in the United Garment Workers Union in Denver announced 400 of their members had volunteered as nurses to help the strikers. All over the country, there were meetings, demonstrations. Pickets marched in front of the Rockefeller office at 26 Broadway, New York City. A minister protested in front of the church where Rockefeller sometimes gave sermons and was chubbed by the police. The New York Times carried an editorial on the events in Colorado, which were not attracting international attention. The Times' emphasis was not on the atrocities that had occurred, but on the mistakes and tactics that had been made. Its editorial on the Ludlow massacre began, "Somebody blundered." 2 days later, with the miners armed and in the hills of the mine district, the Times wrote, with the deadliest weapons of civilization in the hand of savage minded men, there can be no telling to what lengths the war in Colorado will go unless it is quelled by force. The president should turn his attention from Mexico long enough to take stern measures in Colorado. Members of the Colorado National Guard entering the strike district. Clip from the survey newspaper, Source Wiki Commons. The governor of Colorado asked for federal troops to restore order, and Woodrow Wilson complied. This accomplished, the strike petered out. Congressional committees came in and took thousands of pages of testimony. The Union had not won recognition. 66 men, women, and children had been killed. Not one militiaman or mine guard had been indicted for crime. The Times had referred to Mexico. On the morning that the bodies were discovered in the tent pit at Ludlow, American warships were attacking Veracruz, a city on the coast of Mexico, bombarding it, occupying it, leaving 100 Mexicans dead because Mexico had arrested American sailors and refused to apologize to the United States with a 21 gun salute. Could patriotic favor could patriotic fervor and military spirit cover up class struggle? Unemployment, hard times were growing in 1914. Could guns divert attention and create some national consensus against an external enemy? It surely was a coincidence, the bombardment of Veracruz, the attack on the Ludlow colony, or perhaps it was, as someone once described human history, the natural selection of accidents. Perhaps the affair in Mexico was the instinctual response of the system for its own survival, to create a unity of fighting purpose among a people torn by internal conflict. The bombardment of Veracruz was a small incident, but in 4 months, the First World War will begin in Europe. Song Ludlow Massacre, words and music by Woody Guthrie. It was early springtime when the strike was on. They drove us miners out of doors, out from the houses that the company owned. We moved into tents up at Old Ludlow. I was worried bad about my children. Soldiers guarding the railroad bridge. Every once in a while, a bullet would fly, kick up gravel under my feet. We were so afraid you would kill our children. We dug us a cave that was 7 foot deep, carried our young ones and pregnant women down inside the cave to sleep. That very night, your soldiers waited until all us miners were asleep, snuck around our little tent town, soaked our tents with your kerosene. Hey, that's real life. The sources for this post are as follows: text by Howard Zinn from A People's History of the United States, photos from the Colorado Coalfield War Project, song lyrics from woodyguthrie.org, film clips from You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train and Colorado Experience. The Colorado Coalfield War Project offers extensive resources for teachers on the Ludlow Massacre, including a series of photos on the daily life of strikers in the Ludlow tent camps, the prelude to the massacre in the ruins of the tent community. There y'all have it, man. The Ludlow Massacre. What y'all know about that in Colorado? All right, we moving on, man, to the January 28, 1918 Port Rainier Massacre. Before I do that, take a quick break, man. Little session and hit that like button.
Swept, yeah, man. Shit, I keep it cool, dog. Motherfucking awkward. Shit, dog. Shit, I'm a doctor. Shit, we got it cropped up. Yeah, on expedition, nigga. Shit, X to the Z, dog. Shit, you know, we pimping. Yeah, shit, you know, on the expedition. Yeah, we treading motherfuckers. Shit, we got a sense of direction. You know, it's like the cold, man. Shit, my thoughts. I be motherfucking doing it, dog. Filling up the ball. Yeah, dog, I'm in the walls, man, just like Cole. Sister Shaka on the no limits, man. Shit, it ain't my fault. Man, I'm going high, man, in the sky like a hoe. Yeah, RIP, yo. Yeah, shit, you know. Yeah,
All right. January 28, 1918, Pulvernier Massacre. A family photo shows Arlinda Valencia's grandfather, Rosendo Mesa, left, and great grandfather, Longino Flores, right, in Porvenir, Texas. Y'all look at this. Look at that skin tone. Longino Flores was among 15 men and boys killed in the 1918 massacre. Source El Paso Times. On January 28, 1918, 15 Mexican Americans were killed by Texas Rangers. The Rangers went door to door, ordering the inhabitants of the community out of their homes and marched unarmed men and boys to where they were executed. The remaining 140 residents fled Porvenir, and the U.S. Army razed the village. Henry Warren, a school teacher of one of the children whose father was killed, documented the story in names of the victims. His work at the time has been critical to current efforts to recover the history. The list of victims, as documented by Warren, is listed further below. This massacre was part of a pattern of state sanctioned violence on the Texas Mexico border, as documented in the invaluable online documentary project Refusing to Forget. Learn more from the El Paso Times article, Porvenir Massacre on the Texas Border Hunts Descendants 100 Years Later, and from the book Texas Obscurities, Stories of the Peculiar, Exceptional, and Nefarious by E.R. Bills. Victims of the Porvenir Massacre, as I state names, if I do not pronounce them correctly, please excuse me. Manuel Morales, 47, who possessed a deed of 1,600 acres. Romian Nieves, 48, who possessed a deed of 320 acres. Longino Flores, 44, father of Juan Flores. Alberto Garcia, 35. Eutimio Gonzalez, 37. Macedonio Retas, 30. Tiburcio Jaquez, 50. Ambrosio Hernandez, 21. Antonio Castaneda, 72. Pedro Herrera, 23. Severiano Herrera, 15. Pedro Jimenez, 25. Serapio Jimenez, 25. Juan Jimenez, 16. I wonder if these two were actually twins. I could be cousin. You never know. Teach about the border with the line between us. Teaching about the border and Mexican immigration. All right. Pull near Massacre. July 19, 1919. White mobs in uniform attack African Americans who fight back in Washington, D.C. Time period is 1910. We in, okay, 20th century. Much of the violence of Red Summer was directed against black soldiers returning from World War One, such as these soldiers at a YWCA hostess house, Source Library of Congress. On Saturday, July 19, 1919, a major race riot broke out across Washington, D.C., as white mobs attacked the African American community and African American soldiers returning from World War One. The mob was retaliating against an alleged assault of a white woman, Elsie Stefanik, by a black man, Charles Walls. Elsie's husband, a white civilian employee of the Navy. Hundreds of white sailors, soldiers, and Marines formed the mob in uniform. Charles Walls was found late Saturday evening. David Kruger writes, in 1919, the years of racial violence, the mob spotted Ross walking with his wife and began beating them. The couple broke free and bolted home, shots ringing out behind them. The mob tried to break in, but Rawls, neighbors, and friends rallied to his defense. A return fusillade scattered the mob and wounded a sailor. Servicemen fired back as black residents locked their doors and prepared to defend their homes. Page 73. On Sunday, July 20th, the violence continued to grow, in part because the 700 member Metropolitan Police Department failed to intervene. African Americans faced brutal beatings in the streets of Washington, at the Center Market on 7th Street Northwest, and even in front of the White House. By the late hours of Sunday night, July 20th, the African American community began to fight back. While there were no reported casualties that night, dozens were hospitalized. The Washington Post stoked the fires on Monday with an incendiary front page story that included a notice about a 9 p.m. assembly for servicemen to finish what they had started, an assembly that would cause the events of the last two evenings to pale into insignificance. Black Washingtonians took the Post article seriously. They requested official protection from the government, but the state and federal government officials refused. They responded by preparing for an attack by arming themselves. When the police found out that arms dealers sold around 500 firearms that day, they shut down legal gun sales and residents turned to the black market. The violence that broke out Monday night between black Washingtonians armed for self defense and enraged white Washingtonians, many of them uniformed military men, lasted through Tuesday. After 4 days of violence and lukewarm interest by the police to stop the mob, President Woodrow Wilson finally ordered nearly 2,000 soldiers from nearby military bases into Washington to suppress the rioting. The violence resulted in approximately multiple deaths. We found reports from 4 to 38 on the number and over 100 injuries suffered by individuals of both races. The riot was one of the 20 race riots across the nation during the so called Red Summer, but was distinguished by strong and organized black resistance to white violence. Description excerpted and adapted from 1919 Year of Racial Violence by David Kruger and from the blackpast.org. Find a critique of textbooks coverage of Red Summer, a lesson for high school on the related Tulsa Massacre books on Red Summer, and more sources below. All right. July 27, 1919, Red Summer in Chicago. The Chicago riot began on July 27th. It was one extremely deadly and destructive instance of the white rage that fueled mob violence across the United States during the Red Summer of 1919. July 27th was a Sunday, and it was a hot one. That meant the beaches of Lake Michigan were the place for working people and their families. The beaches were segregated, not by any law on the books, but by custom, would be enforced by the police. When a group of black men and women defied custom and tried to swim at the White Beach on 29th Street, they were driven off by a white mob throwing rocks. They returned with larger numbers. The white mob also grew. Unaware of the violence taking place by the 29th Street beach, five black teenagers were enjoying the water on a raft and floated toward that part of the lake. A white man on the shore, George Stauber, began throwing rocks at the boys. One of the teens, Eugene Williams, was hit in the head with a rock and drowned. The white police officer on duty at the beach, Daniel Callahan, refused to arrest Stauber. It was not uncommon for the ethnic white Irish police officers to ignore white on black crime in the city, and that fact touched a raw nerve. Reportedly, 1,000 black Chicagoans assembled at the 29th Street beach and demanded the police arrest Stauber for murder. They refused to arrest him. A black man named James Crawford opened fire on a group of police officers. Crawford was immediately shot and killed, but the crowd did not disperse and other black individuals began to attack whites. By nightfall, rumors of race war in white neighborhoods were running rampant and the rioting began. The rioting lasted almost a week, a whole week. By the end of the first week of August, at least 38 people were dead, 23 black, 15 white, and over 500 were seriously wounded. Thousands of black homes were looted and damaged. Many the targets of Austin. White mob running with bricks in hands during Chicago riot of 1919. Look, burn, loot, murder. There you go. There are many resources about the infamous Chicago riots and its causes, including African American journalist Walter White's October 1919 article, The Causes of the Chicago Race Riot, published in the Crisis. Contemporary resources include articles in New Historian, Encyclopedia Britannica, an article about race divisions on public beaches, published by the Encyclopedia of Chicago in 1919 by Eve Ewing. Read about the representation in textbooks and Remembering Red Summer, which textbooks seem eager to forget, by Ursula Wolf Rocker. Find more resources below. 1919 by Eve Ewing. Yeah. Let's keep it going. September 30, 1919, Elaine Massacre. September 30, 1919, black farmers met in Elaine, Arkansas with Robert L. Hill to establish the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America to fight for better pay and higher education prices and higher cotton prices. Robert Hill, who survived the massacre by Jack Delano in 1943. Source: Library of Congress. A white mob shot at them, and the farmers returned fire in self defense. News of the confrontation spread and massacre ensued, leaving more than 100, estimates up to 800 African Americans dead, 67 indicted for inciting violence, and 12 black sharecroppers, the Elaine 12, sentenced to death. Not only were African Americans massacred, they were also blamed for the event and charged with murder. The Lane Massacre occurred at the end of Red Summer of 1919, a series of brutal attacks on African Americans in more than 3 dozen cities, including Chicago, Washington, D.C., Norfolk, Knoxville, and more cities. The Lane Massacre defendants: Ed Hicks, Frank Hicks, Frank Moore, J.C. Knox, Ed Coleman, Paul Hall, Scipio A. Jones. The group's counsel stands to the left. Source: Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, Central Arkansas Library System. Read more. Read more about the Elaine Massacre at the blackpast.org, Encyclopedia of Arkansas, the New York Review of Books, and The Ghost of Elaine, Arkansas, 1919, by Jerome Carabell, marking the centennial of Arkansas Elaine Massacre on NPR's All Things Considered, a short but descriptive Bloomberg opinion piece. Look what has been taken from Black Americans and the Elaine Massacre in Arkansas, a century of atrocity and resistance, 1819 to 1919, edited by Guy Lancaster. The Elaine Massacre in Arkansas, a century of atrocity. There you go. Read and share how the Red Summer of 1919 is barely mentioned in textbooks, and find a classroom lesson by Linda Christensen of Rethinking Schools, Burning Tulsa, the legacy of Black dispossession, that helps students learn about the direct connection between racial and economic oppression and the need for reparations today. Find related lessons and books for the classroom below. Yeah, y'all want to talk about farmers and shortages and all of that? This what y'all been doing to them. We well into the 1900s, and people still getting slaughtered. All right, let's go to November 22nd, 1919. Bogalusa labor massacre attack on interracial solidarity. And November 19, in Bogalusa, Louisiana, agents of the Great Southern Lumber Company formed a gang to threaten African American labor organizer Sol Dawkins. He was trying to form a union for black laborers at the sawmill, under very dangerous conditions as described by the crmvet.org. Great Southern owned everything: houses, stores, electric utilities, schools, even the segregated parts. They also ran the government. The mill's general manager was the mayor, and the police department took their orders from the company. In addition to the cops, Great Southern maintained a private armed security force to maintain labor discipline. In 1919, after World War I, white and black workers tried to form a biracial union with segregated locals as required by Louisiana law. The company organized racist whites into the Self Preservation and Loyalty League (SPLL). Company gunmen in the SPLL assaulted union members, evicted them from company houses, burned private homes, kidnapped and tortured organizers. On November 21, company gunmen and members of the SPLL showed up at Dawkins' home. He and his family survived the shootout that evening. The next day, on November 22, 1919, Dawkins bravely walked through town, accompanied by white supporters and allies in the labor movement. Determined to undermine any efforts at interracial solidarity, the Great Southern Lumber Company gang murdered four of those white allies, including the American Federation of Labor District Representative. Dawkins and his family were able to escape to New Orleans. The Bogalusa massacre is an example of the violence interracial labor organization experienced from racist anti-labor forces in earlier 20th century. Great Southern Lumber Mill in Bogalusa, Louisiana, the largest in the world at the time, saw black and white workers fighting together for their rights against racist capitalists. Source: New York Public Library. In Bogalusa Burning, the War Against Biracial Unionism in the Deep South, Journal of Southern History, Stephen Norwood wrote, the gun battle in Bogalusa, when white Union men took up arms and gave their lives to defend their black comrade, represents probably the most dramatic display of interracial labor solidarity in the Deep South during the first half of the 20th century. The article referenced above and Bloody Bogalusa, 1919, when four white Unionists died defending their black comrades, provide detailed history of the event and aftermath. Read about Bogalusa during the modern civil rights movement. Find more Zen Education Project materials for teaching outside the textbook about labor history and explore our timeline of selected massacres in the U.S. history. So shout out to the four white men that died looking out for their Native Black American friends, man, and their union partner. November 2nd, 1920, the Oklahoe Massacre. It's 1920. In response to an attempt by African Americans to exercise their legal and democratic right to vote, at least 50 African Americans were murdered in a brutal massacre in Oklahoe, Florida on November 2nd, 1920, and what is now called the Oklahoe Massacre. Prominent local businessman July Perry was among the 1920 Oklahoe Massacre's victims. Source: Smithsonian Magazine. Here's a description from the Oklahoe on fire. The 1920 Election Day Massacre, a quiet Florida citrus town, became the scene of a gruesome racial cleansing that purged the entire black population for over 60 years. By Jason Byrne. On November 1, the day before the election, with robes and crosses, the Klan paraded through the streets of the two black communities in Oklahoe late into the night. With megaphones, they warned that not a single Negro will be permitted to vote, and if any of them dared to do so, there will be dire consequences. Election day came, and at least some blacks did attempt to vote in Orange County. However, none were permitted to enter their respective polling places. White enforcers camped out around the centers, and poll workers were given instructions to deflect their attempts. One by one, would-be black voters were turned away, either by threats of violence or by poll workers who found their names mysteriously absent from the voter registration rolls. Pollsters instructed them to get documentation from the notary public R.C. Bigelow to verify that they were indeed registered to vote. Conveniently, however, Bigelow was unable to be located because he was out on a fishing trip that day. With little other option, most returned to their homes without casting their ballots. Mose Norman, who would not be so easily deterred. After being turned away that morning in his Okeechobee precinct, he rode to Orlando to seek the counsel of Judge Cheney. The attorney instructed him to write down the names of any African Americans who were not permitted to vote, and also the names of the poll workers who had denied their constitutional right. Cheney said a lawsuit against the county would be brought to contest this violation. Norman returned to the Okeechobee with these instructions, along with a handful of black citizens again seeking to vote. As you can imagine, things did not go well. After again being forcibly turned away, he demanded the poll workers' names and exclaimed, "We will vote by God." The response by the Klan was a massacre. One of the people killed was Julius July Perry. Pictured above, here is a description of Perry from Okeechobee on fire. July Perry had become the well respected godfather of the black community. He served as a deacon in the church and the local labor leader, or straw boss. It was said that anyone seeking to employ black laborers needed to speak with him first. He was an admired, brave, and rational thinker, a sort of civil rights leader before there was a civil rights movement. He encouraged young blacks to be educated and stand up for themselves as first class citizens. Perry's wife, Estelle, his three sons and daughter, Caretha Perry Caldwell, lived on a large estate that included their home and several barns and outbuildings. They regularly opened their doors to anyone in need. If anyone is in trouble, they knew they could find advice and sanctuary in the Perry home. Continue reading Okeechobee on Fire. Learn more from the documentary film Okeechobee Legacy of Election Day Massacre 2008 by Sandra Crosser and Bianca White, available for purchase. Sadly, this is one of countless massacres in U.S. history. Find resources below for teaching about the history of voter suppression, sundown towns, and the demand for reparations. Here y'all go, man. Putting it down for y'all, man. Who else doing it like this, man? Who else bringing this to you like this, man? You know what I'm saying? Should I stop it right there? Yeah, I'm gonna stop it right there. The next time we come back, part six, we pick it up at the Tulsa Massacre. I appreciate y'all for watching live, checking it out. Real talk. That's what it's about, man. I'm out, y'all.